You're about to watch how a sleepy Montana town's worst fear, an avoidable mistake that killed a 10-year-old girl, was buried for years, only to explode into the light 17 years later. Montana 1980 cold case solved. Arrest that shocked the community. Amber Rusette's death was written off as a tragic medical error, but one nurse couldn't live with the lie. Her confession set off a chain that led to an arrest, courtroom fireworks, and a town forced to confront what it had protected for nearly 2 decades. Stay with me, because the truth that comes out next will change everything you think you know about justice, guilt, and the cost of silence. Before we dive deeper, take a second to subscribe to Calis-Crime Vault and smash the like button. It's much appreciated. And keep these stories coming your way. Drop your state in the comments below and let me know where you're watching from. The ambulance siren had faded into the dark of a Missoula summer night, but the sound it left behind kept repeating in the minds of everyone who knew Amber Rusette. 10 years old, bright teeth, a laugh that came out of the corner of her mouth, like she was saving the joke for the end, her teacher used to say. Amber was that kind of child who made neighbors stop whatever they were doing to watch her ride by on her bicycle. It was July 14, 1980. The town had been warm and dusty for days. Amber's mother, Karen Rusette, had brought her to St. Luke's Clinic because of a cough that wouldn't stop. It should have been nothing more than a routine visit. A doctor, a shot, a bag of reassurance. But that night, a series of small decisions, each one unremarkable on its own, stacked into a moment that would break a family and haunt a hospital. We open on the clinic's fluorescent hallway, a place that smelled of antiseptic and late-shift coffee. The camera pans across a faded bulletin board with hand-scrawled notices about free immunizations and a photo of clinic staff at a Christmas party. A soft, regretful voiceover says, "In small towns, the people who care for you are the people you trust most. Sometimes a trust is the only thing between life and death." Amber was examined by Dr. Walter Hargrove, a physician who had been practicing in Missoula for nearly 2 decades. He was known for his steady hands and old-fashioned bedside manner. He'd delivered more babies than almost anyone in the county and had a reputation for being thorough. The chart read, "Pediatric respiratory issue, possible bronchitis." The recommended treatment that night was a routine injection of a bronchodilator and a prescription for rest. What followed was described at the time as a tragic medical error. Amber was given an injection that sent her into a catastrophic reaction. Nurses remembered that Dr. Hargrove looked momentarily puzzled, then hurried. Amber's mother watched as medical staff rushed, as monitors beeped and then fell silent. The official report said the wrong medication had been administered by mistake. The county medical examiner concluded the death was inadvertent, a fatal adverse reaction to an incorrect injection. For Karen and Tom Rusette, the official language felt like a foreign language for the hole in their lives. Inadvertent didn't explain the sound of their daughter's last breath. It didn't explain why a pensioned, trusted doctor had been the one with the syringe. In the months after the funeral, they asked questions. The clinic offered condolences, a confidentiality statement, and apologies written in letterhead. The police opened a routine inquiry, and the hospital conducted an internal review. There were memos and notes. Witnesses were interviewed. In the end, the district attorney declined to bring charges. The Rusettes were told that while the incident was regrettable, there was insufficient evidence of criminal intent or gross negligence. The case file closed with a stapled packet of statements and a typed memo that read, "No prosecutable offense established." But the town never really closed the case. People whispered in grocery store aisles. Amber's classmates grew up knowing how to reconstruct the night in a dozen different gory but unspoken ways. Some said it was a mistake. And then there were those who whispered darker things. Shortcuts, pressure in a busy clinic, an arrogant doctor who thought himself above small mistakes. Those whispers hardened into rumors the day The clinic hired a new administrator, and the hospital quietly changed some of its protocols. People took sides. The Rusettes moved into the space of parents who overnight had to become historians of their own grief. They kept Amber's bedroom intact for months, a shrine of crayons and half-finished sketchbooks. Karen would sometimes sit in the doorway, flipping through a worn library book Amber had loved, and whisper questions into the empty room. 17 years can do two contradictory things. It can bury the past until roots take hold, and it can steep a truth until it becomes unbearable. For the community of Missoula, both were true. Life had a way of moving forward. New families moved in. The clinic repainted its walls. Dr. Hargrove retired with the respect of many. But the Rusettes did not care that days had advanced on the calendar. For them, time had stopped. In 1997, a nurse named Margaret Maggie Clark walked into the county prosecutor's office and asked to speak with an investigator. Maggie had been a nurse at St. Luke's in 1980. She was small, quick, and, by her own account, someone who would do anything to keep a team together. She had left Missoula in the late 1980s, moved east with a husband and 2 kids, and wasn't planning to come back. But something in her had lived in the quiet spaces between breaths, memory, and then unbearable remorse. Her confession did not come as a single cinematic collapse. It was a long, halting unspooling. She told prosecutors that on the night Amber died, she had seen more than the paperwork suggested. She had watched Dr. Hargrove reach for a vial in a dim tray and mislabel the syringe. She had watched the doctor, flustered, try to fix it, to make it right. She had been part of the hurried, whispered decision to call the death inadvertent and to downplay the level of error. She told him she had lied, to investigators, to the district attorney, and to the Rusettes, because she had been terrified of losing her job, of the public scorn that might fall on a small staff, of implicating a man everyone liked and trusted. She confessed now because, she said, she could not live with the knowledge any longer. When prosecutors recorded Maggie's sworn statement, the tape captured every tremor of her voice. "I was covering for him," she said. "We all were in our own ways. We thought we could fix it. We thought it would be contained. I didn't know it would follow her like a shadow." The county reopened the file. The town that thought the matter settled watched the life of a man who had been retired for years become the subject of a fresh investigation. Missoula's morning paper splashed a cautious headline: "Cold case reopened in 1980, clinic death." The words "Montana 1980 cold case solved" arrest shocks community would not yet be accurate, but the city felt the first tremors. Investigators dug into old files and located a blue hospital folder that had been misfiled for years. Patient charts had been photocopied over, and continuity was broken by time. Medical records retention had been lax. Nonetheless, forensic pathologists re-examined the old autopsy notes and found discrepancies between the initial medication list and what was supposed to have been administered. Pharmacological records, once thought gone, were found in a dusty supply room. A vial label preserved in an evidence envelope years earlier did not match the medication Dr. Hargrove claimed he had used. What law professors teach in hypotheticals happened in real life. The combination of a credible sworn witness and corroborating documentary evidence can be enough to compel a grand jury. The prosecutor presented Maggie's testimony alongside the newly rediscovered records. The grand jury convened. It is worth pausing here because the unspooling of a small town's long memory is not only legal mechanics, it is human. Legal proceedings make demands of the memory, timelines, credible witnesses, demonstrable links that are not always natural to human recollection. But in this case, the threads pulled taut. When the indictment came, it accused Dr. Walter Hargrove of criminally negligent homicide. He was arrested in September 1997 at a different hospital in Spokane, where he had taken a job as a consulting physician after retirement. The shock ricocheted through Missoula like a struck bell. People who had once praised his steady hands gathered in small groups and tried to reconcile that praise with an indictment. Community reaction was raw and divided. At a town hall convened in the county gym, neighbors filled folding chairs and took turns speaking. Some defended Dr. Hargrove, citing his decades of service and the impossibility, they said, of believing the man they knew could commit such a crime. Others, with Amber's face in their minds, demanded accountability. The Rusettes sat near the front. When Tom Rusette stood, he did not speak to the man in the dock. He spoke to the room, to the hospital, and to the truth. "We were told mistake," he said. "We were told not to ask. I had a daughter who trusted adults to keep her safe. That trust was broken. That is why we are here." Courtroom coverage became a second narrative thread through Missoula's lives. The prosecution painted a picture of a medical system that had once protected its own reputation over a grieving family's right to truth. Prosecutors emphasized that the crime was not a violent, premeditated act, but a criminally negligent decision, an avoidable mistake compounded by a cover-up. They called Maggie Clark to the stand, knowing the moment would be crucible and catharsis combined. Maggie's testimony was the emotional pivot of the trial. She sat small in the witness box, the fluorescent courtroom lights making every wrinkle in her hands visible. She spoke of a night that no one in the room could fully reconstruct without suggestion and color. "I saw the vial," she told the jury. "I saw him reach for the wrong medication. He did not check. We panicked. We were afraid of what it would mean for the clinic if the truth came out. No one wanted to ruin the hospital, the staff, our careers." The defense sought to erode Maggie's credibility. It suggested that her memory, clouded by time, was unreliable. It reminded the jury of the pressures of small-town life and painted Maggie as someone who harbored grievance. The defense called its own witnesses, colleagues who testified that they had trusted Dr. Hargrove and that the hospital's original investigation had been adequate. Between the legal arguments ran the quieter, wilder stream of human testimony. A neighbor recounted how Amber used to collect dandelions and leave them pressed between pages of the Bible. Her teacher read a short passage Amber had once written about wanting to fly. The Rusettes presented a photo album that showed Amber at the park at the 4th of July pancake breakfast, grinning into the camera as if daring the world to be boring. The courtroom, for all its legalese, became a space of moral reckoning. Jurors were citizens of Missoula, people who shopped in the same aisles and had once cheered at the high school football games where Dr. Hargrove had tended to sprained players. Now they listened, shoulder to shoulder with the Rusettes, to the disparate accounts of a single night. During cross-examination, Dr. Hargrove maintained that any error was an unintentional mistake and that he had acted promptly in the moments after Amber's reaction. He insisted he had not tried to conceal the truth and that the hospital's initial handling of the incident had been professional. Under oath, he said, "I am sorry for what happened. I have grieved for that child for 17 years. His apology landed in different ways. For some, it was sincere. For others, the ring of a man backed into a corner. The turning point in the trial, after Maggie's testimony and after both sides had laid out their scripts, was a stack of handwritten shift notes found in a desk at St. Luke's during the reopening. They were not official records, but they showed a hurried entry. Hargrove, syringe wrong, call, cover? The notes were messy, the ink bleeding. The defense argued they were ambiguous and inadmissible. The judge allowed them, and the jury considered them. Closing arguments were a study in rhetoric and restraint. The prosecution asked the jurors to imagine Amber's last moments and to weigh that image against the evidence of deliberate concealment. The defense asked jurors to remember the fallibility of memory and the high standard of proof required for criminal conviction. The judge instructed the jury on the law. They retired to deliberate. When the jury returned, the gymnasium outside the courthouse was packed with people who wanted a first sense of what the decision might mean. The Rusettes waited with a quiet fury. The prosecution sat stiffly, mindful of the moral stakes. The defense looked paler than its usual cool. Guilty. Not guilty. The words themselves are blunt tools. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on a lesser charge of involuntary manslaughter, a determination that the doctor's negligence had risen to the level of criminal responsibility, even if not to intentional murder. In that moment, the town did not feel uniformly vindicated or simply satisfied. A complicated relief settled in the room. For the Rusettes, it meant that Amber was acknowledged in law not merely as a tragic statistic, but as a life taken because of culpable disregard. For others, it was a moment to grapple with the limits of a system that had taken so long to act. The sentencing hearing was predictably wrenching. Dr. Hargrove, by then in his 70s, received a sentence that included probation, community service, and the revocation of his medical license. Many felt the punishment did not match the weight of what had been lost. Others argued that the law had done what it could, given the evidence and the years. But the courtroom drama was not an end. It was a pivot into a new chapter reckoning. The Rusettes used the trial as a platform to advocate for changes in medical record-keeping and mandatory reporting. They testified before a state panel about the need for clearer oversight of clinic practices. The hospital that had once drafted an internal memo now overhauled its procedures, instituted double-check protocols for medications, and launched a public apology campaign. It was, in the terms of institutional behavior, the kind of reform that arrives too late for one child, but might save another. Yet, in the aftermath, the town had to live with the human costs. Maggie Clark, who had come forward and whose testimony had helped secure a conviction, received both scorn and gratitude. Some called her a coward for waiting so long. Others called her brave for breaking a silence that had become a wound. She moved back to Missoula a few months after the trial and volunteered at a hospice, saying she needed to work with people she could comfort. "I can't change what happened," she would say in later interviews, "but I can try to do right in the time I have left." For the Rusettes, closure was not a linear thing. They had wanted justice, certainly, but more than that, they had wanted acknowledgement. The trial offered that in a way nothing else had. Not the initial condolence letters, not the muted hospital visits, but the public airing of facts that had been hidden. Knowing the truth didn't bring Amber back, Karen said in a quiet moment captured on a community documentary about the case. But it stopped us from being alone with our questions. And the town of Missoula changed subtly but significantly. Parents became more insistent in clinics. Pharmacists were consulted as partners rather than background actors. And more quietly, people who worked in healthcare learned what silence could cost. The phrase Montana 1980 cold case solved. Arrest Shock's community became a marker in local memory. A story used in healthcare training and in PDA meetings as an example of what not to let happen again. But if there was an irony at the heart of the case, it was this. The thing that finally made the case solvable was not a new technology or an external subpoena. It was a human conscience that had reached capacity. A single nurse, burdened by 2 decades of guilt, chose to speak the truth. The law, slow as it sometimes is, can only act when someone moves. The story does not tidy itself up with neat moral sentences. In the years that followed the trial, some people who had once defended Dr. Hargrove wrestled with their positions. Friendships frayed. The hospital, pressed by the Rusettes and public scrutiny, paid settlements and endowed a pediatric scholarship in Amber's name. The scholarship funded children's health outreach and a safety training fund for small rural clinics across Montana that, perhaps perversely, felt like consolation and consequence woven together. As with many stories of old wounds reopened, the community was left to perform the delicate work of memory. A yearly memorial on the courthouse lawn began, with dandelions pressed into a ribbon for Amber. Children in Missoula today might learn the story in a way that is distilled, how one life revealed a long pattern of choices, and how one decision to finally tell the truth altered the course of many others. We close this chapter with an image that refuses to be tidy. Amber's sketchbook opened on a bench outside the old clinic, a page turned by the wind. A child's drawing of a kite stretches across the paper. The kite is caught in a blue sky. The string is held by a small stick man with a wide, determined smile. The camera lingers there because, after 17 years of whispers and courtrooms, the life lost is the essential gravity of this story. Names matter. Faces matter. The littlest details we keep are the ones people who loved her carry forward. A cliffhanger for continuation. Months after the trial closed and reforms rolled out, whispers began again. This time about other small clinics across Montana, about village doctors who moved between towns, and about records that might still be incomplete. The investigators who had worked the Rusette case kept getting calls. A retired registrar found an old ledger with odd notations that didn't fit with any known case. And in a drawer labeled miscellaneous at a neighboring county hospital, a nurse found a vial that did not match its label. Was Amber's case the only time such a mistake had been hidden? Or was it a symptom of a wider pattern that had quietly moved under the skin of rural healthcare for years? The community of Missoula had been forced to look inward. Now the question widened outward. Montana 1980 cold case solved. Arrest Shock's community had opened a door. Behind it, there were more rooms, and the search for what lay inside was only beginning. The ledger was not the kind of thing you expected to change the world. It was a battered composition book, its cardboard cover softened by years of hands, its pages crowded with cramped, slanted handwriting and the occasional shorthand abbreviation, filed away in a county records drawer that should have been empty. Ed Palmer, the retired registrar who found it because he couldn't bear the idea that small things might be left unattended. He had been sorting a box labeled miscellaneous. Do not destroy when the book slid out. When he opened it, names spilled across the page like a list of lost birthdays. Dates, initials, short notations. At the bottom of one page, in letters that might have been hurried or fearful, someone had written, "Maintain discretion. Community stability." Ed did what he should have done. He called the people who no one thinks of calling first. The prosecutor who had reopened Amber Rusette's case, the journalist at the Tribune who had covered the trial, and Maggie Clark, who had the steadier moral compass of anyone who ever worked nights at St. Luke's Clinic. The three of them met in a quiet back office above a bakery, the kind of room where people try to make ordinary decisions about extraordinary things. "It's a ledger," Ed said, laying the book on the table as if it were evidence rather than a relic. Not just patient names, dates, remarks, sometimes a county, sometimes a clinic. There are references to settled quietly, and initials I don't recognize. Maya Torres, the reporter, thumbed through pages with that dispassionate curiosity journalists develop. Her jaw tightened as she saw the patterns, a name, a date, a short note, and then the same shorthand phrase again and again. This is not random," she said. "These aren't just mistakes. Someone kept track." Maggie's hands trembled, but she did not look away. "I remember cases they didn't talk about," she said softly. "Not all were children, but there's a way hospitals protect themselves when they think their reputation is at stake. We used to call it containment. I called it lying. What followed was methodical and painful." The prosecutor opened a new inquiry. Subpoenas went out for procurement records, for meeting minutes, for storage room inventories that had, for years, been treated as afterthoughts. The hospital, the county, and a handful of clinics in neighboring counties pushed back. "This is," said an attorney who spoke in clipped phrases, "an intrusion into private personnel files, into long-closed cases." But the ledger had power. It gave investigators places to look. First, the vials. When investigators pushed, they found supply orders that matched an odd pattern. Clinics had been ordering the same type of pre-filled syringes from a small distributor, Cascade Medical Supply, a company based in Helena that had made a point of serving rural Montana clinics with bulk shipments and low prices. When Maya knocked on Cascade's glass door, the receptionist offered the corporate line. "We're a service provider. We provide. We do not direct." But the paper trail told a different story. Purchase orders showed Cascade had supplied pre-filled bronchodilator syringes and other injectables to dozens of clinics over the course of decades. Where there had been occasional inventory errors, there were patterns of batch numbers reused, vials labeled in ways that didn't match their contents, and shipping logs that had suspicious gaps. It was a small thing on paper, a mislabeled batch and notation, a clerk's intimation that a shipment had been adjusted. But looked at together, with a ledger in hand, whole swathes of small towns looked less like isolated incidents and more like a culture of concealment. Investigators broadened the canvas and the stories multiplied. Families who had been told the doctor did what he could suddenly had dates and notations to challenge. Nurses who had left town under quiet pressure called back. A county clerk remembered seeing a sealed packet labeled sensitive handed to a county official after an unfortunate death years prior. What the ledger made possible was connecting names across counties. Amber's case was not an outlier. It was a node. There were notes that matched the way Amber's death had been handled. Immediate condolences, a rapid internal review, a recorded conclusion that used a language inadvertent, non-criminal. There were other names, some adults in their 50s and 60s, a teenager who had been taken in the night after a ritualistic town festival, a toddler whose parents had accepted a settlement and signed a non-disclosure. Each time a family was approached, the same ache returned, the slow dawning that the truth they'd been offered hadn't been truth at all. The political machinery recoiled. The county coroner at the time of Amber's death, Dr. Elias Whitman, a man known for his dry humor and his membership on countless boards, found himself at the center of a storm. Documents showed Whitman had authored several autopsy reports across decades that used identical phrasing dismissing foul play. The signature at the bottom of those reports was so consistent that it looked mechanical. When investigators compared handwriting samples, the language itself appeared templated, copied and re-stamped in case files, as if every inconvenient death was being folded into a pre-approved statement. Dr. Whitman, when called to testify, was a study in controlled surprise. He insisted his reports were accurate, that his duty was to the medical facts and not to an image of stability. "Public panic doesn't help anyone," he said, his voice steady. "People come to us in vulnerable states. My job was to keep calm, to keep communities from tearing themselves apart." It was a statement that, to families who'd lost children, felt like a polite shrug. But there were more documents. Meeting minutes from hospital boards and county health convenings contained discomforting passages. At a November 1983 meeting, pages that had been missing until a municipal audit turned them up, an agenda item read, in neat script, risk mitigation. Consider non-disclosure agreements for adverse events. The minutes recorded a motion to set aside a contingency fund for private settlements. The motion was seconded by a name that landed like a stone in the Rusettes' stomachs. The mayor at the time, a man whose family still ran an autumn festival booth. The minutes showed the hospital and civic leadership had, for decades, treated patient tragedies as reputational risks to be managed quietly. When Maya ran a piece that compiled these findings, longer than anything the Tribune had ever published on local corruption, Missoula shook. The op-ed pages filled with letters. Some readers defended the town's leaders, arguing the deals had been meant to protect fragile economies and the health institutions that serve them. Others called for resignations, for investigations, for confessions. The ledger's presence had done something no grand jury could do by itself. It put a face to the policy of silence. Families came forward with courage that felt like sacrament. They recounted the small ways a hospital's apology could be weaponized, We will provide counseling and a modest settlement, a letter might say, with a line stating that acceptance of the money meant no further action. Some signatories confessed they had felt they had no choice. Medical bills were mounting. The legal system seemed too daunting. A plea for privacy felt like protection. That pressure, the investigators argued, had been the hospitable soil of a culture that rewarded keeping secrets. The hearings that followed were exhaustive. Doctors testified. Administrators testified. The mayor's family issued a statement that read like a condolence and an evasion at once. Our intentions were to maintain stability and protect the institutions people relied on. The Rusettes, who had attended nearly every hearing, felt vindicated and hollow at once. The conviction of Dr. Hargrove had cracked a public shell. Inside, there were more fractures, some of them structural. On a rain-soaked Tuesday in late spring, the county called a public forum. Nobody expected fireworks, but everybody expected fireworks. Families sat on folding chairs under the courthouse's high windows. Maggie, who had returned to Missoula, sat near the front. Ed was there, his ledger under his arm. Maya, exhausted from months of reporting and subpoena fights, was stoic but present. The final act began not in a courtroom but backstage, in a storage room where Ed had once worked. The investigators had kept digging until they found something that turned the ledger from damning to incendiary. An album of photographs tucked behind a stack of delivery receipts. It had the mundane look of a scrapbook. Faded instant photos of birthdays, of staff picnics, of official plaques. But interleaved with those pictures were other images, close-ups of vials, of labels, of shipping manifests. Someone years ago had been keeping a perpendicular track, documenting the objects themselves. On the table at the forum, those images were projected for the first time. A hush fell. Even the courthouse clock seemed to lower its volume. The photographs showed vials with labels that did not match their contents, batch numbers that reappeared in different places, and small, typed notes stained by age. Batch 97. Discrepancy. Resolve quietly. The album's margin notes were in the same hand as the ledger. When Ed turned one of the pages, the room breathed as if in unison. Scrawled under a photo of a young child's crayon drawing, an obvious keepsake from a hospital room, was a single word: pattern. That night, the prosecutor convened an emergency grand jury. The evidence ledger, records, photographs, sworn testimony was overwhelming in its quantity, if not always in the immediacy of its clarity. What made the case different now was scale. Where once it had been one tragic death and a nurse's confession, it was becoming clear that a culture of prioritizing institutional preservation over transparent truth had fanned out across counties. The indictment list grew. Hospital administrators were named, as were procurement officers who had directed supply chains in ways the law would now scrutinize. A municipal official who had signed minutes authorizing risk mitigation protocols was subpoenaed. Dr. Whitman faced multiple counts of falsifying reports and obstruction. Cascade Medical Supplies CEO Gerald Price found himself accused not merely of negligence, but of willful mislabeling and facilitating concealment. The town's comfortable narratives were being stripped away. For weeks, the town lived in two moods at once: a righteous fever and a kind of numbness. Friendships fissured. Church steeples registered attendance in new ways. People who had once lauded the hospital's board began to ask how many lives had been given the same inadvertent label. The Rusettes walked through these weeks like people wearing a new skin, different, vulnerable, with visible seams. The trial calendar filled with names. Testimony after testimony brought detail. But the ledger's single, dreadful contribution was its breadth. There were names of children who had never had public funerals. There were notes that suggested non-disclosure agreements had been used routinely, and in some cases, victims' families had been paid lump sums and told to sign documents that would bar them from telling story. One such declaration, a typed, a signed form that matched many others, had the clinical title resolution for adverse event. After months of careful legal work, investigators found bank records, canceled checks, and notarized signatures. The concealment was not the work of a single frightened nurse. It was institutional. And then came the final chilling revelation, one that no one in Missoula would forget. During an evidentiary hearing, a discovery team opened a long-forgotten storage locker belonging to a now-defunct outreach program that had been loosely affiliated with multiple clinics. The lockers smelled of paper and old plastic. Under a tarp, wrapped in loose cloth, were boxes of patient belongings, stuffed animals, baby shoes, crayon drawings, a faded cardigan. They were relics of lives that had once been cared for. A volunteer had put them aside, planning to return them, and then the years had eaten the plan. The room where the boxes were cataloged filled with a hush that felt like prayer. Among the items, something else lay, a thin sheaf of typed pages, each one a ledger of names and dates. At first glance, it repeated the pattern investigators already knew. But the last page, that final page, was different. It was a calendar of sorts, with dates and towns listed, and chillingly, the names of clinics that, according to the notes, had scheduled quiet closures in the event of adverse outcomes. At the bottom of the page, in a hand that was more sure than hasty, there was a sentence that read like a policy statement. Continue protocols as needed. Community will be preserved. The prosecutor held the page before the camera when the press conference convened. Reporters leaned forward as if proximity could change the moment. This proves coordination, the prosecutor said. This proves policy. The town's reaction was immediate and visceral. People who had once trusted leaders, the clergy, the hospital directors, and the procurement officers as caretakers, now read the words and felt themselves betrayed. Community will be preserved sounded like a sentence from a handbook of fear, a plan to protect institutions while leaving people to their grief. Legal consequences came with the mechanical predictability of indictments and arraignments, but the social consequences were slower and more poisonous. Families sued and settlements followed, but the settlements could not erase the ledger's ledger. Those scrawled notations that had let anonymity and bureaucracy replace confession. Forums erupted in recrimination. Old photographs were reinterpreted through new suspicion. Beneath the civic outrage, a deeper, more persistent question burned. How many people had been silenced in order to protect reputations? Yet the ledger also galvanized change. The state passed stricter laws governing incident reporting and mandated independent reviews for adverse medical events in rural clinics. Hospitals across the region began to institute double-check policies for medications and to require external audits for mortality reviews. These were important reforms, and many credited the Rusette family's persistence for them. But change, no matter how meaningful, did not stop the ache. And then, just when Missoula had begun to breathe in the new era of legality and reform, came a final, chilling act that would be recorded not as an administrative failing, but as a moral mirror held up to the town in full view. It happened in a way that felt almost banal. The county had set up a public archive in the courthouse lawn, a place where people could leave mementos for memory projects, ribbons, notes, small objects. The Rusettes had donated Amber's sketchbook, the kite drawing with its small, smiling stickman, to be part of the memorial archive. Karen Rusette had requested that, if there were any other items discovered in storage rooms, the families be notified and given the chance to place them in the archive. On a Tuesday afternoon, as the sky smudged gray with the approach of storm, a volunteer carrying a cardboard box walked up the courthouse steps. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, were small packages for shoeboxes of personal items, each tied carefully. A note on top read in a tidy hand, "For the archive. Found in storage locker. Please notify next of kin as appropriate." The registrar placed the boxes on a wooden table near the memorial display, and curious townspeople gathered. Cameras and phones poked like insects toward the boxes. The first box was opened. It contained a collection of small things, a plastic ring, a tiny cap, a library slip. The curator smiled politely. The second box was open. It contained a photograph of a bright-eyed boy with a gap-toothed grin. The third box held a pair of knitted booties. People in the crowd murmured. The air smelled faintly of old paper and detergent. Then the fourth box, smaller, taped in an archival way, was opened. Inside was a stack of envelopes, each labeled with a child's name and a date. The curator's hands hesitated as he read the first envelope aloud. Amber Rusette, July 14, 1980. A murmur ran like a current through the crowd. He opened the envelope and withdrew a single item, a small, yellowing label from a hospital blanket, the kind hospitals used to mark fragile belongings. The curator said the next name, Michael Harrow, April 2nd, 1986. The next, Lila Benson, August 12, 1991. The names were familiar now. Many have been part of news pieces. Some have been quietly known only to families. Others had never been heard aloud before. The crowd's murmur rose and became a hum, then a growing sound. When the curator reached the bottom of the pile, his fingers found a final envelope. He turned it in his hands. The envelope had no date. It had no name. It had a single word typed in the corner. Future. The crowd went quiet. At first, nobody could decide what to do. Someone laughed nervously and then stopped. Some people in the front row pressed their faces together with disbelief. Some clutched their phones, as if the screen might provide logic. The curator, his hand steady now, slit the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The top half was blank. The bottom half had been inscribed in the same hand Ed had seen in the ledger. A list of clinics and towns and a set of dates. Dates that marched across the coming months like a schedule in a calendar. Beneath the last date, in a scraped urgent script, someone had written, maintain protocol. Continued discretion. No one knew, no law officer, no judge, no investigator, who had placed the box in the locker, or why the final envelope had been left in such a place as if waiting for discovery. Some said it was a declaration. Some said it was a warning. The prosecutor called it an incitement. Some families called it a threat. The mayor, his resignation still a matter of public petition, stood before a hastily convened press conference and read a statement that groaned with the weight of words that had been chosen to soothe rather than to indict. We will not allow fear to rule Missoula, he said, voice shaking with the strain of trying to be both accountable and contained. But the page's presence in the archive was not a calming document. It looked to the people who had lost children and to those who had read all the minutes and audit reports, like a promise that the machinery of concealment could be restarted. Future read like a door left ajar. That evening the town felt different. People sat in their kitchens and compared notes. Church attendance swelled not for praise, but for counsel. The hospital's emergency department saw a small uptick in patients who came because they wanted to be seen by new eyes. The reform legislation was moving, but Mason County, the broader region, had become a city that no longer trusted the caretakers it had once embraced. The shock of that final envelope did not dissipate in days or weeks. Instead, it hardened into a vigilance. Families forged new alliances, creating advocacy groups that demanded not merely punishment, but structural change, a public database of adverse events, mandatory whistleblower protections for health workers, independent audits for procurement. The ledger had begun as an artifact of concealment. It became a map for reform, and yet the page-marked future kept its hold. In the months that followed, investigators worked to trace which clinics had scheduled audits and which had not. Cascade Medical Supply came under federal scrutiny when additional supply room discoveries showed patterns of mislabeling beyond Montana. 2 small hospitals that had been named in the ledger closed their maternity units altogether, unable to withstand the reputational blows. Employees resigned rather than testify. Then one cold morning in October, a late entry in a hospital log appeared on a third-floor bulletin board. A nurse who had served a long apprenticeship there, quiet, careful, one of the people who had come forward to testify, found a small slip tucked under the current shift roster. On it was a typed phrase she knew all too well: maintain discretion. Community stability. The slip was anonymous, and the handwriting matched nothing anyone could place. Someone had written the policy onto paper and slipped it into the place nurses looked at first thing in the morning. The implication was not lost. The old protocols had not evaporated. They had been sent like seeds into the soil. That night, in a meeting attended by dozens of advocacy members and families who had been fighting for years, Karen Rusette stood up and spoke. Her voice was steady, not because she had healed, but because she had turned her grief outward to purpose. We didn't want to ruin a town, she said, but we will not let a town ruin our children. Her words were met with a standing ovation that felt less like applause and more like a vow. The ledger had done what truth often does. It made things worse and better at the same time. Worse because the scope of the damage was larger than anyone had wanted to admit. Better because the scope demanded a response that could not be cheaply offered as apology. Towns are complex organisms. When infection spreads inside them, often the symptoms are not simply one tragedy, but a constellation of failings that ripple outward. In the months that followed, prosecutions continued. Some defendants pleaded guilty. Some were convicted. Others died before their cases were resolved. The reforms passed. The memorials grew. The archive became a space of pilgrimage for those who wanted their children's names remembered in public. Still, the page-marked future persisted in everyone's imagination like a question suspended between now and what comes next. It was, in the end, less a literal threat and more a revelation of how easy it can be for people, kept in fear and loyalty, in a desire to protect institutions that provide wages and purpose, to make choices that sacrifice transparency for stability. And the ledger, Ed's battered composition book, remained on a shelf in the county archive, a tangible reminder that paper has the power to outlast silence. The last scene of our story is not a tidy court decision or a legislative victory. It is a photograph from the archive, a photograph that was never meant to be public. It shows a town harvest festival on a sunny September day decades ago. Children with sticky fingers, a booth draped in gingham, a line of clinic staff smiling in the crowd. If you look closely at the photo, behind the smiling faces, tucked into a shadowed doorway of the tent, a small hand holds a ledger, an object not yet known to have the power it would one day wield. The camera pulls back. The festival continues. People laugh, buy pies, and dance. The photograph captures the thing that both began and sustained the concealment. An ordinary life where extraordinary decisions are made in small rooms in whispered conversations, where the calculus of reputation and security can be fatal. And then one more cut. The photograph is overlaid with a stark sentence typed in black, plain font, like a caption no one asked for. We learned the cost of keeping quiet. The frame goes black. For viewers across America who follow the story, the lesson is twofold. Systems fail when the upkeep of reputation becomes more urgent than the upkeep of human life. And the truth, once started, cannot be unstarted. The ledger's pages, the envelopes, the vials, and the signatures are now part of the public record. What was once a private policy, neatly wrapped in euphemism and executed in the interest of community stability, now sits in the light where everyone can read it. The last words in that frame are not legalese or a judge's pronouncement. They are, in the voice of Karen Rusette, the words that have echoed through Missoula for years and that now echo beyond it. We should have been the ones to tell the story. Instead, we were told to keep quiet. That stops now. And yet, in the final chilling instance, just as viewers exhale, believing there can be no more darkness, a short, anonymous clip flashes across the screen. A piece of paper in a different hand. folded and tucked into the spine of an old medical manual donated to the courthouse book sale. The camera zooms in as the paper is unfolded. It reads simply, "Protocols continue." Beneath it, in the same hurried script as before, a single date is scrawled, one that lies ahead on the calendar. In a month the town had not yet reached. The screen cuts to black. For a town that had just begun to heal, that final scrap felt like a last ugly promise. That systems do not change simply because leaders fall, and that vigilance is the only real safeguard. Community will be preserved. The words that had once justified quiet settlements now stood accuse themselves. Missoula had been shocked, had been forced to look into a ledger that told too many stories. The ledger had, in turn, forced the rest of the world to look. If there is a moral to end on, not a tidy reassurance, but a warning, it is this. When the people tasked with safeguarding lives begin to value image over integrity, the ledger grows. And sometimes it is the smallest objects, a composition book, a shoebox of keepsakes, a scrap of paper, that reveal the most dangerous truths, and that demand in the end that a community decide whether it will truly change or simply rename its silence. What Missoula, and towns like it across the state, went through in the years after Rusette's case stopped being an isolated headline and became a mirror was not a single thing you can name neatly. It was a long season made of small tremors and slow seismic shifts, the kind of civic whether that changes the way people move through their days and the way they speak to one another in grocery aisles, at PDA meetings, and in the pews after Sunday services. At first, the city's ordeal read like grief rearranged. Families who had lost children found themselves reliving old wounds in public places they had once avoided. Memorial services multiplied. Candles, ribbons, and small plaques appeared on porches and public squares. For many, the court verdicts and the public apologies offered a form of official recognition. The legal language finally gave shape to what families had carried privately. That recognition mattered. It did not undo the harm, but it made it visible. And visibility is the first step toward collective memory. Visibility brought consequences. Institutions that had been pillars of the town for decades were suddenly under the microscope. Boards that once convened in private now met under public records laws and live-stream sessions. The hospital's boardroom, once a place where reputations were tended like fragile plants, became a site for citizen scrutiny. Longtime local leaders faced criminal charges. Some resigned, others were vilified, and a few quietly retired into obscurity. That churn of personnel was not just vanity's fall. It was a structural reset. New people, often younger and less invested in the old loyalties, took seats at tables where decisions about safety and transparency were made. Policy change followed, sometimes slowly, sometimes with the urgent force of a town finally learning a hard lesson. State lawmakers, prodded by families and by reporters who would not relent, passed new requirements. Mandatory reporting for adverse medical events, standardized incident reviews with outside auditors, and protections for whistleblowers so nurses or clerks could speak up without fear of losing a livelihood. Clinics adopted paper check, redundancies, and barcodes. Pharmacies and suppliers agreed to stricter inspection protocols. Some of the reforms were technical, the sort of bureaucratic scaffolding that keeps mistakes from repeating. Others were cultural mandates, training sessions on ethical duty, public forums on transparency, and community advisory boards with real oversight power. But law and policy can only change so much. What the city most had to reckon with was trust, how it is built, and how quickly it unravels. For years, people learned a new grammar of suspicion. Parents began asking questions at the clinic counter they would never have asked before. Teachers noticed families more willing to push back at platitudes and demand records. Friendships that had been built on quiet assumptions strained under the weight of public accusations and private confessions. Some neighbors found themselves on opposing sides of a moral ledger. defenders of long-serving professionals on one side, those who demanded full accountability on the other. These divisions did not always fall along neat political lines. They fell along histories and loyalties, along who had benefited from the old system and who had been left alone with their grief. Economically, the shock rippled too. Small towns depend on institutions. Hospitals and clinics are anchors for jobs and local business. When they are tainted, the fallout is practical as well as moral. Recruitment of new physicians and specialists became harder for a time. Insurance rates rose. Some smaller clinics consolidated or closed. There was a costly balancing act between protecting public health infrastructure and insisting on the standards that make public health possible. In the years that followed, the city learned to budget differently, funneling more resources into compliance, into community health outreach, into preventative care that would reduce the number of emergency or urgent situations where mistakes are likelier. There was also a generational effect. Young people who grew up in the years after the ledger was found carried a different civic education. They entered workplaces and classrooms with a vocabulary for transparency, for asking hard questions, for demanding checks and balances. In civic clubs and high school civics classes and at graduation speeches, the Rusette case and the ledger did not appear as morbid nostalgia, but as a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when institutions value image over integrity. This generational vigilance would become one of the city's most durable defenses against repetition. At the same time, the social fabric reknitted in ways the town's leaders could scarcely have predicted. Advocacy networks formed, not only to litigate and to reform, but to care for people left in the wake of the scandal. Support groups, community health initiatives, and scholarship funds, including the pediatric scholarship endowed in Amber's name, created new channels for communal care. Those things did not erase the losses, but they did create a more resilient local ecosystem, one where neighbors could hold both grief and action in the same hands. Still, the ledger's final anonymous note, the one that read future and suggested protocols could persist, left a stubborn unease. The town institutionalized checks because it had to, but people knew that regulations are only as strong as the commitment behind them. The memory of boxes and storage, of shoeboxes, of keepsakes, of anonymized lists and discrete settlements, meant that vigilance had to be perpetual. Whistleblower protections were enacted, but culture change required more than laws. It demanded that the next generations be taught to value candidness as a civic virtue, that telling the truth could no longer be painted as a betrayal of community, but was its highest loyalty. Emotionally, Missoula lived inside a paradox. Grief and reform circulated together, and neither resolved into a tidy end. The Rusettes and families like them learned to share their sorrow in ways that invited public action. They became advocates and teachers. Nurses and clinicians who had once felt complicit or silenced emerged as leaders in new oversight roles. Some of the town's formerly trusted figures repented publicly and worked to repair what they could. Others refused to speak, leaving wounds that would never fully mend. By the time a generation had turned, the city was different in ways both obvious and subtle. It had more public meetings, more audits, and more laws. It also had a new vocabulary of accountability. People had learned that silence can be a kind of violence. The ledger, once a symbol of hidden wrongdoing, had become a cautionary relic, preserved in public archives where anyone could read its pages and learn. In memorial ceremonies, Amber's name became shorthand for a challenge: to treat institutional safety and human dignity as inseparable. And still, the final image that lingered in the city's imagination was neither legal nor programmatic. It was a photograph in the archive, a faded festival snapshot in which a small hand clutched a ledger even as children danced. That photograph reminded people that choices are often made in the quiet corners of ordinary days. The reforms could change procedures, But they could not change the human propensity to protect what we value. The real work was to reteach the town how to value people above reputation. So Missoula moved forward carrying both scars and new strengths. The era that followed the cold case was a time when the city learned to live with the knowledge that institutions must be transparent, that grieving families deserve truth, and that citizens must keep watch. It became, in the end, less a place that had a single moment of failure and more a living example of recovery, imperfect, ongoing, and tethered always to the memory of a 10-year-old girl whose laughter had once stopped a town in its tracks. If there was a final lesson Missoula offered to anyone who listened, it was this. The ledger taught them that silence can shelter harms for years, but it also taught them that once the truth is unlatched, a community's labor, legislative, moral, and personal, becomes the measure of whether that truth will protect the future or merely be a grim chapter in a longer story. In Missoula, after so many years, people chose to keep working at that answer. They did not celebrate a final victory. They accepted a responsibility, and in that acceptance, small and steady, they found the only real defense against the ledger's quietest threat, a living commitment to speak first for those who cannot speak for themselves. Before you go, make sure to hit subscribe and share, tap like, and turn on notifications. That way you'll never miss the next mystery, solve cold case videos. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.